Hey, amazing listeners, you're in for a treat today because we've got a story that's all about transformation and leadership. Picture this. You're the CEO of a thriving company, but you start to wonder, what's really going on behind the scenes? That's exactly what David Sinclair did. He went undercover at his own warehouse to uncover the truth, and what he found was nothing short of shocking. But the best part? He didn't just stop there. He took action, leading to a major shift in how his company operated. Stay tuned to hear how David's journey changed not only his company, but also the lives of the people who helped build it. David Sinclair sat in his office, staring at a pile of employee complaints and operational reports that painted two completely different pictures. On paper, SwiftHaul Logistics was running smoothly. Profits were steady, deliveries were on schedule, and costs were well managed. But the anonymous complaints from warehouse employees told a much darker story. Unsafe working conditions, sudden shift cuts, overworked staff, and managers who treated workers as disposable. Every time David brought these concerns up to his regional managers, he got the same response. It's just a few disgruntled employees. But the growing number of complaints made him think otherwise. David had built this company from the ground up, starting as a single trucking hub before expanding into a nationwide distribution powerhouse. In the beginning, he had been involved in every detail, visiting warehouses, talking to workers, and making sure operations ran fairly. But as the company grew, he relied more on reports and middle management, losing direct contact with the people who kept the business running. He needed to see the truth for himself. Instead of sending an auditor, David made a decision. He would go undercover as a night shift warehouse worker. He picked one of the company's most problematic distribution centers where complaints had been highest. If something was broken, he would see it firsthand. To avoid being recognized, he ditched his usual polished look, trading his expensive suit for scuffed work boots, faded jeans, and a company-issued uniform. He let his beard grow out and used the name Mike Dawson to apply as a temp worker. Within 48 hours, he was hired without an interview, a red flag in itself. The night he arrived for his first shift, he immediately sensed the tension. The warehouse was loud and chaotic, with workers moving frantically to keep up with demand. The break room was small and neglected, and the air smelled of sweat and dust. His manager, Frank, barely looked at him, grunting a half-hearted, "New guy, try not to slow us down." No orientation, no safety briefing. Just a nod toward Carlos, a seasoned worker, and an expectation to get to work. As David grabbed his first heavy crate, he realized this wasn't going to be just an observation. This was going to hurt. But he needed to feel the struggle to truly understand it. As David followed Carlos into the heart of the warehouse, the sheer scale of the operation hit him. Conveyor belts clattered loudly, forklifts weaved through tight aisles, and dozens of workers moved at a frantic pace, loading and unloading shipments. The air was thick with dust and the smell of grease, and the concrete floors were slick in places, a clear safety hazard. The warehouse was obviously operating at full speed, but it was obvious that things were far from efficient. Carlos led David toward a long row of loading docks, where stacks of boxes waited to be sorted. "Stick close and don't get in the way," Carlos muttered, his voice barely carrying over the noise. His movements were fast, precise, and practiced. He knew exactly how to lift, stack, and scan shipments with speed. David, on the other hand, was struggling. The first time he lifted a 40-pound box, he felt the strain in his back immediately. Carlos chuckled. "You'll get used to it. Or you'll quit. Most new guys don't last a week." As they worked, David took in the conditions around him. The warehouse floor was a maze of disorganized pallets, and workers had to maneuver around obstacles just to move shipments. The air was hot and stagnant, despite the industrial fans mounted on the walls. He noticed some of the workers wiping sweat from their faces, their shirts clinging to their backs as they hauled boxes from one end of the warehouse to the other. He caught sight of James, a younger worker who was visibly struggling to keep up. His arms trembled as he tried to balance a stack of packages, and just as he turned to load them onto a pallet, he lost his grip. The boxes crashed to the floor. James flinched, bracing himself as Frank, the night shift manager, stormed over. "Are you kidding me?" Frank barked, his voice cutting through the warehouse noise. "If you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't be here." James muttered an apology and scrambled to pick up the fallen boxes. Frank didn't help, he just stood there, arms crossed, watching. David clenched his jaw. This wasn't just tough work. This was a workplace running on fear. Carlos leaned in, lowering his voice. Just keep your head down. Frank doesn't like excuses. David nodded, but inside he was already taking mental notes. Something was deeply wrong here, and he was going to find out just how bad it really was. As the shift wore on, David saw firsthand just how brutal the night shift was. Workers weren't just handling heavy loads, they were racing against the clock, working at an unsustainable pace with no room for error. The conveyor belts moved relentlessly, and if someone fell behind, the entire process backed up, leading to even more pressure. The employees weren't just tired, they were exhausted, drained, and operating on pure muscle memory. What struck David most was how normalized the struggle had become. No one complained, no one questioned the system. They just kept their heads down and worked. Even when James, still shaken from his earlier mistake, wiped sweat from his face and clutched his shoulder in pain, he didn't dare ask for a break. David took a closer look at the working conditions. The warehouse was severely understaffed, with workers covering multiple stations when they should have had assigned roles. The break schedule was erratic, and there were no water stations nearby, forcing workers to wait for their only 10-minute break just to rehydrate. It was clear that productivity was prioritized over people. Then there was Frank, the night shift manager. Instead of stepping in to help, he stayed in his office, only emerging to scold workers or demand they move faster. At one point, when a worker asked if they could swap out after 3 hours of non-stop lifting, Frank scoffed. "You want a break? Work faster, and maybe you'll finish early." David clenched his jaw. So that's how it was. No support, no empathy, just intimidation. During a short break in the cramped and dimly lit break room, Carlos finally spoke up. "You're asking a lot of questions, man. You new guys don't usually care this much." David hesitated before responding. This doesn't seem right." Carlos let out a bitter laugh. "It's not. But what choice do we have? If you complain, Frank finds a way to punish you. Cuts your hours, gives you the worst shifts, makes your life hell. And corporate? They don't care. We're just numbers to them." David felt something tighten in his chest. These weren't just bad working conditions. This was exploitation. He had expected inefficiencies. He hadn't expected this. One thing was certain, he wasn't going to let this continue. The breaking point came during the final stretch of the shift, when a critical shipment fell behind schedule. Workers were already exhausted, but Frank wasn't interested in hearing excuses. He stormed onto the warehouse floor, his voice booming over the sounds of conveyor belts and forklifts. "Move faster, we need this shipment out before the next truck arrives," he barked, his tone laced with irritation. David, his muscles already aching from hours of heavy lifting, watched as James struggled with a particularly heavy crate. His knees buckled slightly, and before anyone could react, he lost his grip. The crate crashed to the floor, spilling its contents across the loading dock. Frank's face twisted in anger. "Are you kidding me? What the hell is wrong with you?" James, breathing heavily, bent down to start picking up the fallen items. His hands were shaking. "I'm sorry, boss. Frank cut him off. "Sorry doesn't fix this. If you can't handle the job, maybe you don't belong here." David had seen enough. His pulse quickened as he stepped forward, his frustration boiling over. Maybe if we had enough people working this shift, this wouldn't have happened. His voice was calm, but firm. Frank's head snapped toward him, his expression hard. "What did you just say?" David didn't flinch. "I said maybe if you actually supported your team instead of tearing them down, we wouldn't be this far behind." A few workers nearby froze, their eyes darting between David and Frank. No one ever talked back to Frank. Frank took a step closer, his jaw tightening. "Listen, rookie, if you don't like how things are run here, you can walk out that door right now." David met his glare without hesitation. "Maybe I will, but not before I make sure every person here gets the respect they deserve." The warehouse fell into a stunned silence. Carlos subtly stepped between David and Frank, giving a slight shake of his head, as if warning him to back off. David exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay in control. Now wasn't the time to blow his cover. But soon, it would be. Frank lingered for another moment, then scoffed and stormed off, muttering under his breath. David clenched his fists. The problem wasn't just bad management, it was a toxic culture. And soon, it was all going to change. By the time the shift ended, David had seen enough. The exhaustion on the workers' faces, the blatant disregard for safety, and the fear-driven work environment were worse than he had imagined. But now, it was time to act. As the workers shuffled toward the break room, ready to clock out for the night, David took a deep breath. No more playing along. He stepped forward, his voice steady but loud enough to carry through the room. "Before you all go, I need to say something." Workers paused, exchanging curious glances. Frank, sitting at a desk with his feet up, sighed loudly. "What now? You quitting already, rookie?" David met his gaze and pulled off his work gloves. "No, I'm not quitting." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his company ID. "I'm David Sinclair, CEO of SwiftHaul Logistics, and I've been working this shift undercover." The room fell completely silent. Carlos, who had been leaning against a table, stood up straight, eyes widening. James's mouth dropped open. Even Emma, the older warehouse worker, froze mid-sip of her coffee. Frank let out a dry laugh, but it was nervous now. "You're joking." David's expression didn't change. "Do I look like I'm joking?" He turned slightly, looking at the team. "I came here because I wasn't getting the truth from upper management, and now I've seen it for myself." His voice hardened. "What's happening in this warehouse is unacceptable." Frank shot up from his chair, scrambling to regain control. "Listen, I was just following orders." David cut him off. "Orders? Whose orders say to cut hours without notice, to force workers to clock out before their work is done, to ignore safety regulations and berate employees for struggling under impossible conditions?" Frank opened his mouth, then shut it again. He had no answer. David turned to the workers. "This stops now. Effective immediately, Frank is fired. A new manager will take over this warehouse, one who actually values the people keeping this place running." A stunned murmur swept through the room. James let out a breath he'd been holding. Carlos exchanged a glance with Emma, disbelief in his eyes. David wasn't done. "And to the rest of you, I'm sorry. You deserve better. And from this moment on, you will get better." For the first time since walking into this warehouse, David saw something new in the workers' faces. Hope. As the weight of Frank's firing settled over the room, David knew his job wasn't done. Getting rid of one bad manager wouldn't be enough. The workers needed real change, and they needed it now. He took a step forward, addressing the entire team. "I've seen how hard you all work, and I know how little recognition you get. That changes today." The workers exchanged uncertain glances, still trying to process what was happening. They had heard empty promises before. David turned to Carlos, the most experienced worker on the floor. "Carlos, you've been holding this place together, training new hires, covering extra work, and stepping up, even when no one asked you to. You've been doing the job of a supervisor without the title or the pay. That ends now." Carlos's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" David smiled. "Starting immediately, I'm promoting you to shift supervisor. You'll get the authority and the paycheck you should have had a long time ago." A few workers clapped, and Carlos let out a breath. "Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say." David continued, looking around at the others. "And I know you've all been underpaid and overworked, so, effective immediately, every worker here is getting a raise." A murmur of shock rippled through the group. James, still stunned, whispered, "Are you serious?" David nodded. "Every worker who's been pulling extra weight because of staffing shortages will be compensated, and from now on no one will be forced to clock out early to manipulate labor costs. If you work the hours, you get paid for them." Emma, the older worker, pressed a hand to her chest, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "No more lost hours?" David shook his head. No more lost hours, no more ignored safety concerns, no more toxic leadership. For the first time since stepping into the warehouse, David saw something shift in the workers' expressions. It wasn't just relief, it was belief. "This isn't just a one-time fix," he promised. "I'll be following up personally to make sure these changes last. This company doesn't run without you. It's time you're treated like it." The exhaustion in the room seemed to lift, replaced by something long overdue: hope. A month later, David returned to the warehouse unannounced, eager to see if the changes had truly taken root. As he walked through the doors, he was immediately struck by how different the place felt. The energy in the warehouse was no longer one of fear and exhaustion. Employees worked with purpose, moving efficiently between stations, but there was no frantic rush. The atmosphere was calm and the workers looked focused and confident, a stark contrast to the chaos he'd witnessed during his first visit. Carlos, now fully settled into his role as shift supervisor, greeted David with a smile and a firm handshake. "It's going well, Mr. Sinclair. We're getting things done faster and no one's burning out anymore." Carlos's posture had changed. He was standing taller, more assured in his leadership role. The employees respected him, and it showed. David glanced around and noticed improvements everywhere. The warehouse floor was organized, and there were clear pathways for workers to navigate without running into obstacles. The safety protocols were being followed, with safety equipment readily available at every station. The workers were taking their breaks on time, and the break room, once dingy and cramped, had been cleaned and updated, a small but significant sign of the overall change. David made his way to the back of the warehouse, where he found James and Emma working together at a pallet station. They were moving at a steady pace, but there was no rush, no tension. When James saw David, he gave a quick nod and said, "Things are much better now. I'm not afraid of losing my hours anymore. It's nice." David nodded in response. "That's the goal. No one should fear their job." As he continued through the warehouse, he could see the confidence in the employees' eyes. They weren't just doing their jobs, they were taking ownership of the work. The most telling moment came when Emma, the older worker who had struggled so much before, waved over David. "Mr. Sinclair, I just wanted to thank you. I've been here for years, and for the first time I feel like we're actually a team." David smiled, feeling a sense of pride. The change wasn't just physical. It was in the people. The toxic atmosphere had been replaced with mutual respect and a sense of belonging. It was everything he had hoped for and more. He knew there was still work to do, but for the first time, he could see that the changes were real and sustainable. As he prepared to leave, he saw the staff working together as a cohesive unit, no longer just doing their time, but building something stronger together. It was a moment he would never forget. As David walked out of the warehouse, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The transformation in just a month was nothing short of remarkable. The team was operating with renewed energy, confidence, and pride. The toxic environment that had once suffocated the workers was now replaced by a culture of respect, safety, and open communication. For the first time, David could see that his company wasn't just about meeting targets and hitting numbers. It was about the people who made those numbers possible. True success wasn't just about profits or growth. It was about creating a workplace where employees felt valued and supported. David had learned a painful lesson. You can't fix a company from the top down if you're disconnected from the ground level. Reports, spreadsheets, and quarterly meetings didn't capture the reality of life on the warehouse floor. The stories of long hours, unfair treatment, and overwork had been brushed aside by management for too long. By getting his hands dirty and seeing things firsthand, David was able to understand the human cost of the company's growing success. It was a wake-up call, one that changed his perspective as a leader. The most important lesson David took away was that leadership isn't about just giving orders. It's about being present, listening, and taking action when you see the need. It's about setting the right example, holding yourself accountable, and making sure that every decision, big or small, has the well-being of your team in mind. He realized that his role as CEO was not just to make the tough calls, but to ensure that the company culture reflected his values that prioritized fairness, respect, and transparency. David didn't stop with the warehouse. Over the next several weeks, he implemented surprise visits to other locations, ensuring that the changes he had made weren't just temporary fixes. He introduced mandatory training for managers on how to create positive work environments, and started regular one-on-one check-ins with employees to get direct feedback. As he continued this journey, David knew this was just the beginning. His eyes had been opened, and he was committed to creating a workplace where people weren't just working for a paycheck, they were working for a company that truly cared about them. And that, he realized, was the real measure of success. The key lesson from this story is that effective leadership begins with understanding the realities of your employees' experiences. David learned that disconnection from the ground level leads to missed opportunities for real change. By going undercover, he realized that profits and productivity should never come at the expense of employee well-being. True leadership means listening, being present, and making informed decisions that prioritize people over numbers. David's journey showed that when employees feel valued, supported, and respected, they perform at their best. And that's the foundation of lasting success in any company.